Parking enforcement is changing in several parts of the country, and that's exactly why a headline like Massive USA Parking Law Changes needs a closer look before you take it at face value. Here's the most important thing to understand right away. There is no single nationwide parking law in the United States. Parking rules are set almost entirely by states, counties, cities, and even individual municipalities, which means a rule that carries a steep fine in one city may not exist at all just a few miles away. So when you hear about new parking law changes, the real story is usually happening in specific places, for specific reasons. And today we're going to walk through what's actually verified, where it's happening, and what it means for you as a driver. Before we get into the details, drop a comment below with your state or city. Parking enforcement looks completely different depending on where you live, and it would be genuinely useful to see how these rules play out in your own neighborhood. Let's start with why this patchwork exists in the first place. In the U.S. legal system, traffic and parking regulation is primarily a state and local power. States set broad vehicle codes, but day-to-day parking rules, where you can park, for how long, and what the penalty is if you don't TS, are usually written into city or county ordinances. That's why a fire hydrant violation might cost you one amount in Boston and a different amount in Houston, and why a city can pass a tougher towing ordinance without that rule applying anywhere outside its own borders. Keep that distinction in mind for the rest of this video, because it's the key to understanding every example we're about to cover. So what has actually changed recently? Let's go state by state and city by city, because several real verifiable updates have happened in just the past several months. In California, a new statewide law, Assembly Bill 1299, took effect on January 1st, 2026. This law authorizes local governments to waive or reduce parking penalties for people who are unable to pay, and it requires that a payment plan be offered if requested, which is designed to help prevent escalating fines, vehicle towing, and lien sales that can disproportionately affect low-income drivers. Notice what this law does and doesn't do. It doesn't create new violations or new fines. Instead, it gives California cities a tool to soften the financial impact of enforcement for drivers who genuinely can't pay. This is a state law, so it applies across California, but it does not apply outside the state. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, city leaders approved a very different kind of change, a stricter towing ordinance aimed at unpaid parking tickets. Under this ordinance, any vehicle whose owner has unpaid citations and has not resolved them can be towed and impounded, with that stricter enforcement phase beginning January 1st, 2026. City officials have pointed to roughly $17 million in unpaid fines tied to this enforcement push. This is a Milwaukee City ordinance. It is not a Wisconsin state law, and it does not apply to drivers outside city limits. Down in Galveston, Texas, the City Council approved a package of tougher parking enforcement rules. The changes allow officials to boot or tow vehicles with multiple unresolved citations, and the city also expanded its towing rotation and tightened the rules for which companies can participate. Galveston officials had cited roughly $6 million in outstanding parking fines as the reason for the update. Again, this is local to Galveston. In St. Louis, Missouri, the city resumed booting and towing vehicles over delinquent parking tickets for the first time since 2018. In just the first 10 days of that renewed enforcement, the city treasurer reported collecting $50,000 in unpaid tickets and booting close to 30 vehicles. That's a striking number, but it reflects one city's enforcement decision, not a nationwide shift. And in New York City, which has one of the most complex parking systems in the country, The basics are worth restating because so many visitors get caught off guard. New York City is designated a towaway zone under New York State vehicle and traffic law, and illegal parking, whether it's a meter violation, an expired registration, or blocking a hydrant, can result in towing with no grace period in certain zones. Alternate side parking rules, used for street cleaning, are enforced across all 5 boroughs, and while those rules are sometimes suspended for holidays, restrictions like hydrants, bus stops, and no standing zones remain active regardless. That's a mix of state authority, the vehicle and traffic law, and city-level enforcement through the NYPD and city traffic agents. Notice the pattern across all of these examples. California passed a statewide law about how penalties are handled for people who can't pay. Milwaukee, Galveston, and St. Louis passed or activated local ordinances aimed at collecting on already unpaid tickets. None of these is a new nationwide parking law, and none of them means that every American driver is suddenly facing new fines. They're real, they're verified, and they matter if you live in or visit those specific places. But the scope stops at the city or state line. Now let's talk about the violations themselves, because regardless of which city you're in, certain categories of parking violations show up again and again across the country, even though the exact fine amounts and enforcement methods differ locally. No parking and no standing zones are usually marked with signs or curb paint, and the difference matters. No parking generally means you can stop briefly to load or unload, while no standing typically means you can't stop at all except to pick up or drop off a passenger. Fire hydrant and fire lane violations are treated seriously almost everywhere, since they involve emergency access. Most jurisdictions require a minimum distance from a hydrant, though the exact distance can vary by state and city, so check local signage rather than assuming a number. Blocking a driveway is treated as illegal in the vast majority of jurisdictions, often the moment the vehicle blocks access, regardless of how briefly you're stopped. Parking in a crosswalk or too close to an intersection is another common violation, since it can obstruct visibility for both pedestrians and other drivers. Sidewalk parking is prohibited in nearly every U.S. jurisdiction because it forces pedestrians into the street. Accessible or disabled parking violations are enforced heavily and often carry some of the steepest fines and penalties of any parking violation, precisely because they affect people who depend on that access. EV charging space violations are a newer category. Some cities and states have started ticketing non-electric vehicles that occupy dedicated charging spots, or EVs that stay parked after charging is complete, though this enforcement is still uneven and depends heavily on local ordinances. Bus stops and designated transit zones are almost universally restricted, since blocking them disrupts public transportation. Parking against the flow of traffic is illegal in most states under general vehicle codes, and in some cities, expired registration or license plates can trigger parking enforcement action even if the vehicle itself is parked legally otherwise. Beyond that, many cities have specific restricted zones, residential permit areas, loading zones for commercial deliveries, and areas near schools with dedicated pickup and drop-off rules. Violating these can lead to a straightforward fine, but repeated or serious violations, like blocking a fire lane or accessible space, can escalate to towing or booting, where a device is placed on the wheel until fines are paid. Whether any of these penalties apply and how severe they are always comes down to the specific city or county ordinance. So treat any fine amount you hear about as an example, not a universal number. So, what should you actually check before you park somewhere unfamiliar? Start with the street signs. Read them fully, since many combine time restrictions, permit requirements, and day of week rules on a single sign. Look at curb markings, since color coding for zones like loading, no parking, or accessible spaces varies by city but is almost always intentional. Check for meter restrictions and time limits. And don't assume a meter you've paid covers every nearby restriction. If you're in a residential area, look for permit-only signage. Near medical or accessible spaces, confirm you have the correct placard or plate if you're using one. Around fire lanes, look for red curb paint or posted fire zone markings. And always be alert for temporary signage. Construction, filming, or special events can override the normal rules for a specific day, and that temporary sign takes priority. Many cities also have their own parking apps or digital meter systems now, so it's worth checking whether the city you're in uses one before you assume a physical meter is your only option. If you do end up with a ticket, here's the practical path forward. First, check exactly what violation you're cited for and the location listed. Errors do happen. Second, look at the payment or response deadline, since many cities apply late fees or double the fine if you miss it. Third, decide whether to pay the ticket or contest it. If the citation seems wrong, most cities have an official appeals process, usually through the city or state's Parking Violations Bureau or website. If you plan to dispute it, take photos of the signage, the curb, and your vehicle's position as soon as possible, since evidence tends to disappear once you drive away. Finally, always use the official payment or appeal channel listed directly on the citation or the relevant city or state government website, not a third-party site that shows up in a search engine. It's also worth understanding, in general terms, that ignoring a parking ticket can create bigger problems than the original fine. In many jurisdictions, unpaid tickets can lead to late fees, and in some places, unresolved citations can eventually affect vehicle registration renewal or lead to booting or towing, as we saw in Milwaukee, Galveston, and St. Louis. But that's not universal. The consequences and the timeline for them depend entirely on where you are. So don't assume every state handles unpaid tickets the same way. Before you go, here's a quick checklist you can actually use next time you park somewhere new. Read every line of the posted sign, not just the first one. Check the curb color for zone restrictions. Confirm the meter or app payment method that specific location uses. Look for permit-only or residential restrictions. Check the distance and markings around any fire hydrant or fire lane. Watch for temporary signs that override the normal rules. And if you're using an accessible space, make sure your placard or plate is valid and clearly displayed. The bottom line is this: parking enforcement really is changing in a number of U.S. cities and states right now, but it's happening city by city and state by state, not through one sweeping federal law. The safest approach, no matter where you're driving, is to rely on the posted signage in front of you and the official website of that specific city, county, or state parking authority, because that's the only source that reflects the rules that actually apply to the spot you're parked in.